Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Christian Sunan, and I lead the Latino Leader Program here at the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life at Georgetown University. Here we work to bring the principles of Catholic social teaching to national and global conversations, to build bridges across religious, political, and ideological divides, and to encourage young people to see their Catholic faith as central to their life and work. I want to welcome all of you here to Georgetown's Capitol campus for this Latino Leader Gathering, more than just the halftime show, Latino culture, backlash, and belonging in the United States. We've had a great response to this conversation with all of you here with us in person and the hundreds that are watching online. For those who can't watch tonight, our conversation will be recorded and posted afterwards on our website for later viewing. So last night, Bad Bunny's Debí Tirar Más Fotos won Album of the Year at the Grammys. It was the first time in history that a Spanish language album has won the top prize. This coming weekend, Bad Bunny will play the halftime show at the biggest sporting event of the year in the United States. Bad Bunny's meteoric rise to fame is the most recent and also the most notable example of a phenomenon that's been hundreds of years in the making in the United States, and whose beginnings predate even the United States itself. Even before this country existed, there were people of mixed Hispanic and indigenous ancestry living in what is now territory in the U.S. mainland. Since then, millions more have moved to the United States from Latin America, and generation after generation has redefined and built what it means to be this culture in the United States that we now call Latinos. As the second largest ethnic group in the United States after white Americans, and one of the fastest growing ones, Latinos are simultaneously one of the greatest examples of the strength of our multicultural pluralist democracy, and to those who are keen on preserving a dominant white Christian identity in the country, one of the greatest threats to that society. Unfortunately, the latter group has become more vocal, more prominent, and more powerful, stoked by nativist populism exemplified by President Donald Trump and emboldened by his administration's daring first year in office. As the teaching of a global church that has defined itself from the very beginning as a multi-ethnic communion, Catholic social thought affirms the equal dignity of all people and affirms also that a multicultural society that encourages diversity is a good thing. So today we'll discuss the threats to that multi-ethnic society here in the United States, but also its gifts and the ways that Latinos specifically, as such a vital part of the life of the United States and of the U.S. Catholic Church, can revitalize pluralist democracy in this country through politics, arts, culture, and faith. And we've brought together four remarkable leaders to do exactly that. Ana Dini Morales is a poet, a librettist, and a fellow in the humanities at Georgetown University's Center for Latin American Studies. Her works in opera and poetry have considered everyday family love, modes of empathy, patterns of political, legal, and religious violence, and family separation as a result of U.S. immigration enforcement. Mark Hugo Lopez is the Director of Race and Ethnicity Research at the Pew Research Center. He's an expert on issues of racial and ethnic identity, Latino politics and culture, the U.S. Hispanic and Asian American populations, global and domestic immigration, and the U.S. demographic landscape. Mike Madrid is a political consultant and a leading expert on Latino voters. He has served as political director for the California Republican Party and as senior advisor to both Democrats and Republicans. He's also a co-founder of the Lincoln Project, and he's author of The Latino Century, How America's Largest Minority is Transforming Democracy, which is just an absolutely incredible book for anybody who is at all interested in Latino politics in the U.S. And finally, Mar Muñoz-Visoso is the executive director of the Secretariat for Cultural Diversity in the Church at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. In 2010, Pope Benedict XVI awarded her the Benemerenti Medal, which is one of the highest honors the Pope can bestow on an individual for, quote, sustained and exemplary service to the Catholic faith. And so with that, let's kick off our conversation. To open, let's go first to Mark. The Super Bowl is this weekend, and I mentioned the backlash that came after the announcement of Bad Bunny's performance at the Super Bowl. What do you make of the national response to the announcement of his performance, and what does it show about attitudes towards Latinos and Latino culture in the United States?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I think it shows a number of things. It highlights how while the nation has become more diverse, there continue to be fault lines and areas of tension between different parts of the U.S. population towards immigrants, towards the diversity that immigrants have brought to the country, and towards the diversity of the Latino population. Just a couple of facts I think that are important to note. I'm not sure if the audience knows this, but something on the order of 72 million people have arrived as immigrants in the United States since 1965. The nation has more immigrants than any other country in the world. We have more than 53 million people living in the country who were born outside the United States. That diversity has impacted the nation's diversity. The U.S. is more diverse today because of the arrival of so many immigrants. And so when you see moments like Bad Bunny's, the announcement of Bad Bunny being at the Super Bowl, that reflects a number of things. On the one hand, did you notice all the pride among Latinos for having somebody like Bad Bunny on such a stage? It is yet again another example, as you were saying, of another Latino star who has really risen to new heights at the national level. But at the same time, in many ways, he represents, to some, the diversity of the country and the challenges that it faces, to say it in a as neutral a way as possible, but that's something that's also adding to the tension that many Americans feel. So not all Americans are of the view that diversity necessarily has made the country stronger. Most are, but not everybody is.
Anna, the same question to you. You're an artist. You work with many artists. What do you make of the reaction to Bad Bunny's to the announcement of Bad Bunny's Super Bowl halftime performance, and what does it say about the place of Latinos in the U.S.?
I think that you began to suggest this in your introduction, and it's basically that Bad Bunny builds upon a previous history of many, many artists, and just in the musical industry, in the past half century, Héctor Lavoe, Ricky Valens, who sang La Bamba, obviously Shakira and J-Lo, who performed in a previous halftime show during, I believe, the first administration in 2019. Many, Ivy Queen, many, Ricky Martin, who sang, La Copa del Amor, right, which was amazing, and so these are artists who had already paved the way into, and they were crossover artists, right, who'd paved the way into a larger stage, a U.S. stage, an international stage, and who already created this sense of international and national and fusion unity amongst many Latino populations. What is different about Bad Bunny is that he's emerging during a time of the intensification of white nationalism, the reification of gender. What does it mean to be female? What does it mean to be male? The reification of who we are versus who they are, right? What makes us who we are, which is what you are also alluding to. And so Bad Bunny wears this sombrero on a, on the goal of the football goal, right? And he's wearing a sombrero that's a jíbaro sombrero. So what is the jíbaro? What is Puerto Rico? Puerto Rico has a legally uncertain status. So we are legally precarious people, right? Okay, so you take a legally precarious individual. You add that the jíbaro is related to the word cimarrón, which means escaped people, escaped person. Puerto Rico is historically an island of escaped people, right? So legally precarious, peripheral to society, right? And then you add the fact that Bad Bunny is emphasizing expansivity. A lot of young people talk about how he's broken down in the genre of reggaeton, a sense of this very hyper masculinity genre. So he's introduced the idea of queer on the dance floor in a way that wasn't necessarily done as intensely before. In his videos, he has abuelita, dancing with the abuelita. He goes back to El Gran Combo. So he explicitly is creating these communities that are powerful and dangerous because of their solidarity, and on a stage that is the Super Bowl, that is already an intensification of the sport, of who we are, of gender, of nation, right? So you have this extremely peripheral, proud, not apologizing for mixing Spanish and English, making quote unquote mistakes. That's pretty it's a pretty powerful challenge.
Mike, to you with the same question. What do you make of the reaction to the announcement of the halftime show performance by Bad Bunny? What does it say about the position of Latinos in U.S. society?
I think when I heard that he was going to be doing the halftime show, a couple things went through my mind. The first was there are no other cultural events that the United States of America has on an annual basis that brings the attention of the Super Bowl halftime show. It literally is a performance with whoever the artist is that seeks to define that American moment. He was not chosen. The NFL knows what they're doing. Okay, they know what they're doing, and the nature of him being there is an inherently political act. But it's also a great marketing strategy of where the country is going. There's a market imperative here too. Let's be very, very clear about that. They're talking about building a fan base, building support. There's not a lot of people over the age of 65, white people over the age of 65, who know what reggaeton is or know who Bad Bunny is. You saw some of that from the pushback of the last Super Bowl halftime show, and the Super Bowl halftime show is increasingly becoming more and more politicized because as we're in this Rubicon moment, this transition moment of the United States becoming a non-white majority country, which will happen in about 10, 11, 12 years, we will increasingly see artists, especially speaking to younger generations and younger markets, that don't reflect the older typical understanding of who America was. And so, of course, there's going to be pushback, but there's also going to be a tremendous source of pride. What I think the main takeaway is, and this I think a lot of people in politics are coming to understand, for about a decade now, we've kind of used this moniker that politics is downstream from culture. In other words, if you change the culture, you change our politics. I don't believe that's true anymore. I believe that politics is culture. I think Donald Trump exemplifies that. So when you have a Bad Bunny there on stage, a few weeks after, days after the pronouncements at the Grammys, his very presence is political. And it's not something that is just happening by chance. He's not somebody who's making an incursion there. He's not somebody who is going to do something that will shock the conscience of the nation because we weren't prepared for it. He's uniquely prepared for it. It's emblematic of the moment, and it's emblematic of, I think, of a changing nation's culture, society, and our politics.
Mar, what do you make of the reaction, and what does it mean about Latinos in U.S. society?
Well, I think that there is obviously, as we just heard, there was not one reaction. There was many reactions. If you're, obviously fans are delighted, but even if you're not, Benito's, biggest fan, representation matters, and so the majority of Latinos out there are saying, good for you, man, represent us. And they're rooting for them. They're rooting for him in his parish of Santa, of La Santísima Trinidad in Vera Baja, Puerto Rico. The nuns are praying for him. His mom is a catechist, for God's sake. And yeah, his lyrics sometimes are provocative and sometimes graphic. I don't necessarily listen to him only when my son is at home, which he does listen to him, But there is that sense of pride and that sense of seeing your culture represented in the biggest stage of the world, is something to be proud of and celebrated. And then there was the hate coming from certain, I would say small but very vocal political factions, and amplified by the echo chambers of social media in a polarized society. And in their minds of these groups, it is unthinkable. It cannot be that a Latino who is going to perform only in Spanish is going to headline the biggest event, the biggest entertainment event, in the nation. And so they, they kick and scream, and Perhaps his political and social activism, which we saw on display last night at the Grammys. Before him giving thanks to God, he said what he said, you know. And so it doesn't align with theirs, and so that's what bothers, you know, them also about it. So they disapprove vociferously, as I said, and I think, but to me, the most important thing is what those attitudes, you know, those are symptoms of a deeper problem, a deeper sickness in the soul of our nation. I would say, first of all, it displays deeply seated attitudes and beliefs which continue to normalize unjustified bias, prejudice, discrimination, and cultural superiority. That's one of the first symptoms. The second one, I would say some people simply refuse to come to terms with the reality of the demographic and cultural realities of the United States. They just simply refuse to come to terms with it. Others just, I would say, have a very narrow view of what the motto of this country stands for, et pluribus unum, out of many, one. See, in this narrow interpretation, you know, a unity, you know, et pluribus unum says is a unity that doesn't annul our individualities or our differences of opinion or our different traditions and cultural expressions and experiences, but builds on the common values and the beliefs of the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all. Instead, this narrow view, I propose, seeks unity through uniformity and policies of forced assimilation, which have done so much damage. And finally, I propose that those negative reactions emerge also from a lack of true knowledge of the history and the geography of this country. Hispanics have contributed tremendously to the history, the culture, the economy, the arts, the science in this country. As you said, they've been here before the United States was the United States and have helped build this country throughout. The United States does have the distinction of being the second country after Mexico with the most Spanish speakers in the world. And that has been true for many, many, many generations. It's nothing new and has nothing to do with recent migration. The majority of us are bilingual by choice. We don't want to let go of the language of the ancestors because it's the way the culture is transmitted. And we don't want to renounce it and let it go. But the majority of us, the vast majority of us, are born and raised here and are English dominant. So there is a lack of knowledge because, and I think I propose, and I finish with this idea, we need to reclaim the narrative because it's been stolen from us. If you hear from the hateful rhetoric that is going out there, you would hear that, you would think that all Latinos, all Hispanics are immigrants, that all immigrants are here illegally or undocumented, and that, you know, all Latinos are criminals, rapists, dirty. You add to the list of things, the name calling that we've been receiving out there. And so Latino, in the narrative that is being put and disseminated out there, Latino equals criminal. So if you are brown or black in this country, you don't belong.
Yeah.
And so I say we need to reclaim the narrative and start telling the truth.
Thank you, Mar. Yeah. You talked about this sickness that has pervaded the history of our country and the many symptoms. And Mark, I want to turn to you now to tell us a little bit about what the data shows about some of the symptoms of this sickness. You're the Director of Race and Ethnicity at Pew Research Center. You have some of the best data on Latino voters and opinions that exists. And in November, Pew published data on Hispanics' opinions on the current administration, and more importantly, their views about the future, their future in the country. And I'm going to read a few lines from that report that are particularly significant. About 2/3 of respondents, or 68%, say the situation of U.S. Hispanics today is worse than it was a year ago, while 9% say it's better. This is the first time that most Hispanics say their situation has worsened in nearly 2 decades of Pew Research Center Hispanic surveys. When asked this question in 2019, late during Trump's first administration, 39% said that the situation of U.S. Hispanics had worsened, and in 21, 26% said this. Now it's at 68%. That's a huge jump and a massive shift in outlook for a very significant group in U.S. society. So what can the data tell us about the sources of this new pessimism among Latinos in the U.S.?
It's a really great question, and these findings are sobering. And they really tell a story, if you look at some of the other findings, a consistent story of Latinos being pessimistic and downbeat, not only about their situation in the United States, but even about the nation itself. About 3/4 say that they're dissatisfied with the direction of the country. When you take a look at how Latinos feel about the top issues, the economy continues to be a major issue for many Latinos. In our survey last year, we found that 3/4 would say things such as they're worried about the cost of living, they're worried about the cost of buying a home, they're worried about being able to find a job. That's one part of the story. We also have noticed, though, that over the course of 2025, Latinos have grown more worried that somebody they know or they themselves could be deported. That number had gone from about 40% back in February to over 55% in October of 2025. So over the course of the year, Latinos became more concerned about somebody they know or they themselves potentially being deported. One of the findings that you had highlighted in our conversation, Christian, was a really interesting finding about, do Latinos think that they might want to leave the United States? And we found that about 1/3 of Latino adults told us that they have thought about leaving the U.S. And when you ask them why, about half said that they had thought about doing so because of the political situation in the country. Notably, it is not immigrants who are saying that they want to leave. Yes, about 1/4 said that. But more than 36% of U.S.-born Latinos told us that they were thinking about leaving the U.S. Now, I want to stress that this is something you hear a lot of people talk about at election time. People do talk about, I'm going to leave the country. Can't believe that so-and-so has been elected president, whether a Democrat or a Republican. So this is something that happens regularly. And we haven't tracked it, so I don't know how things have changed. But I do think it's also important to note that it takes a lot to leave the country. And if you're thinking about it, you're serious about it, it is not an easy thing to do. And yet it is notable that it is U.S.-born Latinos who are more downbeat about this than immigrant Latinos. Those are just the tip of the iceberg in terms of some of the findings. But that really gives you a sense it's about immigration enforcement. It's about the way in which the Trump administration's policies are seen as impacting Latinos. And by the way, majority of Latinos say the policies have been bad for Hispanics, even among Latino Republicans. Yet we still found in our survey that those Latinos who voted for Trump, while his approval rating has declined, 81% of Latinos who voted for Trump in October, said that they still approved of the president's job performance. So there are some interesting patterns within the data, but notably Latinos have become more downbeat, and this is the most downbeat we've ever seen them.
So I was so shocked when I read the numbers you just mentioned about the number of people who had thought about leaving the country, and I was particularly struck by the fact that it's U.S.-born Latinos that are saying this to a large degree, and not just those who have immigrated. So I want to dig a little bit more into those numbers. How does that compare to previous years when you've done this polling? How has that number shifted? And I'm also interested because I know Pew, as of Thursday, I think, has a new study on U.S. attitudes around immigration enforcement tactics specifically. How do those numbers help you make sense of this phenomenon? And then how does it compare to previous years? And what does that mean in terms of what are the political implications?
Yeah, so really great question. This is the first time we've really asked this question, but have you thought about leaving the country? We have not asked that before, so I wish we had to know how things have changed. Definitely something we'll track. In terms of our most recent report was a survey based in January where we asked Americans about a whole range of things, such as, is it acceptable to record ICE agents arresting somebody? Majority of Americans say yes. Is it acceptable for ICE to arrest somebody based on the way that they look? Majority of Americans say no. Yet it's interesting, when you take a look at some of the immigration policy data we've had over the last year, and you look at the attitudes of Latinos, you see a couple of patterns. First, whether Latino Republicans or Latino Democrats, you find that they are in support of deportations of people who've committed crimes. So there is support for that, even among Latino Democrats. Where there are differences is which other groups should be potentially deported, and also where those deportations should happen. So, for example, you'll find that Latino Republicans are more likely to say that it's okay to arrest somebody at a business or outside of a school. Latinos who are Democrats are less likely to say that. But there are some interesting areas of agreement. Deport people who've committed crimes, and strong areas of disagreement among Latinos by political party. So when you ask about the politics about this, I think it's hard to sort of say there's one trend here. I think there's many different stories here, and yet I want to add one last piece. When you look at Latino Republicans compared to other Republicans, even Latinos who voted for Trump compared to other Americans who voted for Trump, Latino Republicans are usually not quite so aligned with other Republicans. They may, in the majority, say that those who've committed crimes should be deported, but non-Latino Republicans are more likely to say that. So those are some of the patterns that you'll see in that Latino Republicans are somewhere between. And it's not just on immigration. It's on economic policy, it's on gun policy, it's on abortion policy, a whole range of things. So there are some very, very interesting nuances within the data about Latinos and politics in their current situation.
Well, and it's something that hints at a point that you make repeatedly, Mike, that we'll get to in a second, that Latinos truly are this important swing voter population, and they're really, there's very complex politics to play out there, and we'll talk about that in a second. But first, I want to come to you, Anna. You're a poet and you're a librettist. You've translated some of Latin America's most celebrated poetry into English and made it available to an English-speaking audience. And you've written multiple operas. Your most recent, Las Místicas de México and Zavala Zavala, have explored the ways that deeply human love among family members can be juxtaposed to a colder, dehumanizing impulse for power in various political decisions. Zavala Zavala especially took a close look at the dynamics in the first Trump administration's use of family separation. As you think about those zero-tolerance immigration policies back then and the deliberate use of family separation as a political tool, and you look to some of the dynamics of immigration enforcement that are happening today throughout the country, and particularly in Minneapolis and other cities, what's different about the way these power dynamics play out today compared to several years ago, and what has stayed the same?
So I think the first thing you all know is that the effort in this administration is a much more aggressive multi-front effort. So the attack on our institutions, the attack on DEI, the degree of censorship, right? So the effort has intensified. The other thing is that, to what you were saying, Mike, it's more of a show. Right? So that show is really important, that public removal of individuals, that they can go into any place. And this is very typical of a dictatorial regime, because when ICE comes into a school or a workplace, they're not just removing someone who might be a criminal, they're publicizing fear. So there's a double strategy there. It's first to, yes, but the mask is we're removing criminals. When you take off the mask, it's fear and power, right? To put everybody else in line, right? So that's the strategy there. So that's part of the show. The other thing you were saying, Mike, about vying, like basically, and this is very typical of dictatorial regimes, right? What's at stake here? And a lot of what's at stake are national symbols and metaphors. So the Gulf of Mexico versus the Gulf of America. What difference does that make? Well, it makes a big difference, right? Who performs at the halftime show? Who got the Nobel Prize? It doesn't matter what you did. It matters that you got the prize, right? The show. So that show is really, it's powerful, it's important, and we really have to pay attention to it. And it's significant. It's a very important symptom of a dictatorial regime. The other thing I was thinking about is that whereas in the first administration, the public feeling was more that the border was in the South, Now the border's everywhere. The border is in the public space of the streets. The border is in the intimate space of homes where children have fear to go out. The border's at school. The border's in a workplace, right? And so it's like this multiple intense cutting and incitement of fear. And on the one hand, the strategy has been to break down solidarity. What I think is extraordinary is that actually people are increasing their solidarity. Do you know, Mar, you were saying, I don't know about reggaeton, or you, Mike, you were saying, I don't know about reggaeton. People over 65 don't know about it, but now you do, right? And even if you were, like my mom would have been really upset about the language in reggaeton, but she would have been really proud that Bad Bunny was performing, right? And so, interestingly enough, there's been this turn that's incited an expansive solidarity that's really important.
That's so interesting, and I think we were talking a lot about this when we were mentioning just the celebration around the announcement of Bad Bunny's halftime show, the solidarity that comes out of it. What is the role of art and artists in pushing back and creating that solidarity? What role can Latino art and culture play to push back against these destructive forces? And what are some of the major challenges that Latino artists might face in this particular context when trying to do so?
I mean, I think first of all, the definition of what it means to be an artist. For me, an artist is anyone who works to improve the lives of others. That's what an artist is. That's creative work. That's a creative act, right? So I don't you know, I don't look at it as like, oh, the professional, right? Oh, the person who has the repertoire. Oh, the person who has the job. Or I don't look at it that way. I look at it at the creative act to improve people's lives. That's a work of art. And so that's the first thing. The second thing, we were talking about this before our conversation, is that the Latin American diaspora, our art comes from a long history of many different types of oppression. So this is not anything new. Do you know, like your family came after, right on the hinge of the Chilean dictatorship. Spain suffered from Franco, right? Mexico has, even though they're officially a democracy, has over 110,000 disappeared individuals. That was the official number a couple of years ago. The DR had its dictatorship, right? So this is art that is deeply embedded in the need to constantly express its memory, and it's deeply resilient art. It's filled with fusion, and that's part of our power as well. Like any Caribbean kid, musician, can play, you know, let's say if you're trained in the classical repertoire, you can play Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, but hey, also reggaeton, bomba, bolero, danza. That's very unique and resilient about our culture, right? And so there's that, but you mentioned another word, and I think it was alegría, right? So that's infuriating. That when Bad Bunny goes on a stage and plays this range of music that is quite a fusion, especially an Afro-Caribbean fusion, and those rhythms are there because they are the memory of Africans who were brought to this country, right? And the fact that they do that and there is alegría at the same time, you can't take alegría. That's very powerful. Among those things, the most important thing is solidarity. That's what artists can do, is have solidarity, have nuance, have long conversations vis-a-vis the fact that personhood is at stake. This is an attack on personhood. It's an attack on an idea of humanity. You know, Mari, you mentioned Bad Bunny and what he said. He said first, ICE, go away ICE, then thanks God. And then he said, we are not savages, right? And that doesn't come out of anywhere. That's a long history of identifying certain types of body used for labor, right, as animals, as not human. And so the opposite, what is the opposite of that? It's that you're unique, right? And this comes at the same time as the intensification of AI. You are unique. You are complex. You are infinite in your diversity. Your face, right? You're infinite in your diversity. So we need to have long conversations. We need to move on from the soundbite. We need to know, I'm going to write this, not AI, right? It's many parts of our culture that are coming together at the same time. So,
in another one of these conversations back in May at another Latino leader gathering, we were kind of puzzling over the question of given the enormous diversity within the community, what makes the Latino identity? And one of the things that one of the participants mentioned that is an idea I love so much is it's a preoccupation with freedom. It is this from no matter what background you come from in Latin America, there is this deep history of colonial oppression or of something else, and that doesn't necessarily need to manifest itself as a sort of victim politics, but it's this love for freedom, this preoccupation with freedom that makes its way into various modes of art, and I think celebrating the joy and the uniqueness of the human experience is one of the ways to do that. That preoccupation with freedom is also one of the reasons that the American experience is such an attractive one to Latinos. And so, Mike, you've had a long and distinguished career of analyzing this love for the American experience and the way that it interacts with Latino attitudes. You've been doing this for almost 30 years, and 30 years ago you were here at Georgetown as an undergraduate writing about this stuff. Yeah. And now you're one of the foremost experts in the country. So Mark shared his insights from the November survey that Pew conducted, and I know the two of you have had a very interesting conversation on your podcast, The Latino Vote. So it's on the resources page for this dialogue on the website if you want to check that out. It's a fascinating conversation between these two about the pessimism numbers that we just talked about. But you've written, Mike, that the optimism of Latinos as a people will, quote, reinvigorate the American experiment. So in light of that, what do you make of the unprecedented pessimism expressed among Latinos now, and especially its tied to our country's political situation? And is this a lasting change with lasting political implications, or is it a specific temporary response to this current administration's rhetorical and policy oversteps?
Boy, there's so much to this. Let me start by saying, and this is a many decades-long conversation Mark and I have been having as his work has been documenting the unfolding of Latinidad and its changing and its transforming and what it was, what it's been, but perhaps most importantly, what it's becoming. As an undergraduate at Georgetown back in the early 90s, I was fascinated by the idea that by the end of my lifetime, America would become, for the first time in her history, a non-white majority country. And the whole idea of America, the whole idea of self-governance, the whole idea of the way we went about revolution, our mythology about who we are, doesn't really mesh terribly well with Latino culture, at least not half of it. Right? The American idea, this American experiment, is really in many ways the apex of white Western Protestant thought. And I knew that, again, being in Lowinger Library and looking at the numbers where this was going to all head by the time I was as old as I guess I am now, that America's stewardship, this idea, this grand experiment, would be in the hands of a people who did not come from that tradition. They would be in the hands of people, whether they were practicing or not, people who had a Catholic imagination of the world, a Catholic understanding of the world, a more communal place of being, of sense, of family, of comunidad, of all of these things that define our culture. And I was fascinated with the idea of whether or not our concepts, our notions of freedoms meshed with those that were central to the founding. And like any Georgetown student, that's what I wanted to spend my life reconciling and watching unfold, because that's normal behavior, I guess. But what I found along the way, and of course it's changed and been challenged many times, but the one central theme that has always, always, always been there is this deep, abiding optimism about the future that comes from the seeds of immigrants. And I want you to think about this for a moment. I would say every country, but especially the United States of America, requires immigration in order to survive, because it needs people who are so profoundly faithful and hopeful about the idea of America that they will leave everything that they know and have known and that their people have known for centuries on the risk and on the bet that things will be better. That is the optimism that makes America move from one generation to the other. And so that was what was so both illuminating and really more heartbreaking when I saw Mark's data, is for the first time, as somebody who's been watching this unfold for 3.5 decades, Latinos are pessimistic about this country and their role and their place in it. But let me tell you what does give me some hope. The immigrant is still the most optimistic about what America can be despite what's going on in this country, despite what is happening in our communities, despite the terror that is being inflicted on it by our own president. Still the most optimistic about who we can be are the people that are least likely to have a place at the table to express that optimism. You gotta love that. You've got to believe in that as what America still can be. And so it doesn't terribly shock me or surprise me that those that have been here longer are saying, I want out. But remember, what they're also saying is that they believe that somewhere else is better. That's the danger of losing the American experiment, the American project, this idea that anybody can come here and be fully American. And so I am both heartbroken, but I'm also so lovingly optimistic about the hope that Latinos, specifically immigrants generally, will be to continue this crazy idea that we had 250 years ago this year, that somehow we can make this whole thing work. But, and this was the conclusion in my book, it's that optimism, the optimism of the immigrant. And I think that's how I would refine it now during this very dark era in American history. It's not just the Latino optimism, which is gone probably, if not for a moment, then maybe longer, but it remains with the immigrant. And I just want you to really breathe in what I'm saying. Despite being hunted, despite being terrorized, the most optimistic about who we can be as a people are still Latino immigrants. And that's the great hope of who we can be.
So then the question becomes how politically do we harness that optimism? What does it mean? What do these new trends mean for the way that Democrats and Republicans approach Latino voters in the midterms? What does it mean for how they approach immigration? What is how do we harness that optimism as we go into an election?
Well, I think we're doing it, and that's also what gives me some hope, and I'll speak to that in just a second. Let me say this. I've had a very, very unique story and journey in politics in this country. I'm one of a very, very small number of Americans who has been involved at the highest levels of campaigns on both sides of the aisle. That's rare, and I'm the only Latino that I know of that has worked with presidential campaigns on both sides. I have never in my 3.5 years of looking at this seen Puerto Ricans in New York City, Dominicans in Passaic County, New Jersey, Central Americans in Manassas, Virginia, Mexicanos in Tarrant County, Texas, 2 nights ago, Cubans in Miami, all voting the same way. Something is stirring. A new bloc has been created. We say all the time, been saying this since I was a kid, we're not a monolith, we're not a monolith. At the moment, we are a monolithic vote. But, and let me make this really, really clear, in the same way that we moved away from the Democratic Party in historic numbers in 2024, we are moving in equally historic numbers away from the Republican Party in 2025, heading into 2026. That's the sign we need to listen to. Our community is not realigning Our community is de-aligning. If we look to the Republican or Democratic parties for our salvation or for our advocacy, then shame on us. There's enough evidence to show, and our people are voting with their feet. The only swing voting group in this country that exists in a meaningful way are Latino voters. And we're voting against things, not for things, because there is no aspirational message coming from either side of the aisle. What does that mean, to answer your question? It means that Latinos have to define the agenda. We have to stop looking for people to climb up the ladder on one side or the other and start to take care of us and fix the parties. I can tell you as an older man now who's been doing this since I was a younger man, that will never happen. We have to define what that agenda is, and the great beauty is, once we define what it means to be Latino in this country, both parties will crash to us. Of that I am convinced. And I'll end on this one ironic note. How is that possible, Mike, if we all come from different countries and different diasporas, and some of us speak English, and some of us speak Spanish, and some of us speak both, and some of them went to college and didn't go to college? Overwhelmingly, the common thread, overwhelmingly, is we are the blue-collar working class of this country. We are the people that are being left behind. We called it the essential workforce during COVID. It was the Latino workforce that was allowing other families to stay sheltered in place. We were the ones that are making everything from the agricultural components to the house building to the manufacturing components to on and on and on. That's our monolith. That is our agenda. And we need to start melding all of the diasporas, all that ethnicity into a working class blue collar agenda at this time of extraordinary change, and define it and advocate for it ourselves. That's the answer. My answer, anyway.
Yeah. Mad, you're a leader in the U.S. church on issues of cultural diversity, pluralism, and belonging. You've spent your career making the Catholic Church responsive to its significant Latino population and making sure it provides resources for the adequate formation of that population suited to its cultural realities. What are some of the major challenges that the church must still overcome to ensure that Latinos are not only given a proper place in the life of the church, but are formed in such a way that promotes and encourages their participation and leadership in public life? What are some of the major challenges that exist to that?
Well, part of the question is already being answered right now, but let me tell you a couple of things that are happening which helped us diagnose, what are some of these challenges. In recent years, the Catholic Church in the United States has undertaken at least two processes that have involved Latinos very heavily. One of them was the fifth Encuentro of Hispanic Latino Ministry, which culminated in 2018. And then more recently, throughout the pandemic, we did something online that culminated in a national event, what's called Journeying Together. And Journeying Together was an intercultural process of encounter with young adults, between bishops, young adults, leaders in ministry, and young adults of all the different cultural families, right? And so the whole process was designed to listen, just to shut up and listen to the young adults and let them tell you. And when young adults, and this is true for every one of the cultural families, but was certainly true for Latinos, when you ask young adults to tell us, what concerns them, what ails them, what are their hopes, and they sense a sincere interest and that you're really, really willing to listen, they will tell you. Mm-hmm. They will tell you, all right? And I think out of the fifth Encuentro, we learned several things. One, that Latinos, particularly the younger you go, are already, in many cases, are not just a minority, but are becoming the majority of the Catholic Church. Mm-hmm. So if you go, 18 years and younger, you already have more than 54% of Catholics in the United States self-identify as Latino, all right? That's one. But then you also realize that they are joining, formation programs and education programs at the certification level, in much bigger numbers than Anglos or English-speaking or whatever you want to call the other populations, right? They're there, they're committed, they want to know, they want to learn more, they want to lead their communities, and they're showing up. I mean, in my parish, my foreign parish here in Maryland, St. Camilo's, the first ones to come back to church after the pandemic and the churches was closed was the Guatemalan community, for God's sake. They were the ones that braved out the pandemic and became the ushers and became the servers and everything, because everybody else was not showing up, but they did. And not only came to Mass and to their prayer groups and whatever else they were doing, they just served the other communities as well. So, what we learned during the encuentro is that we learn about all of the statistics that Pew puts out, that Cara out of Georgetown, the Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate puts out, and we realize that we need to grapple as a church with this reality. And that any church, any parish, any diocese that willfully or unwillingly ignores this reality, that's on its own peril. Right? The second thing that we realize is that also because of our diversity, we already have people who are very much ready to lead, ready to go in positions of leadership in the church and in society. And so there needs to be that kind of identifying who those natural leaders are and tapping them, training, informing, investing in them, because that's oftentimes what stops us, that, many of us don't make the jump from certificates to degrees, for example, to be able to work in ministry, or are relegated to serving our own communities. But we could be, who are going to be, you look at the population, you look at the numbers, who are the next generation of school principals, of music directors, of social ministries, the pool is what it is, right? And so I think that we need vocations. I mean, even to the priesthood or the religious life. The pool is what it is, and I think we still have not come to terms with the idea that that's where we need to look, and that's where we need to make an effort, our recruiting and forming and training and tapping for leadership. And I think that, it was just referred to this, we are the only ones that, even though we're going on the pessimistic side, that still keep hopeful, in the idea not only of this country, but also on the idea of the church as an extended family, as our extended family. Yeah. And the place where we find the values. I work a lot with Protestant and evangelical Latinos, and some of the things that they said is, well, I'm not a Catholic, but I was educated in Catholic schools. And you know what? It provided me the values and the ethics and the morals that I needed to be successful in my business in the world. So I think that we have a lot to bring, but Latinos, especially young adult Latinos, they're not a captive audience by any means. They're not, as the last two election cycles, they're not in politics, but they're not in the church either. We're going to go where we feel welcome, where we feel seen, heard, and loved. And if that's not happening, then we need to overcome, all of those things and realize. And I think that the fifth encuentro really helped make those leaders, those talents that many of our Latinos have visible. And so we have seen we're looking with hope to the future, because we've seen that more and more dioceses, more and more churches and parishes are beginning to tap them, and that more of them are are following. It was such a blessing for us to have Pope Francis, because you could identify with a leader that you could tell he gets us. Yeah. He gets us. And one of the things that he kept encouraging was a better way of politics. Yeah.
Well, that goes to my next question, is what is the better way of politics that the church can show to the United States? What does Catholic social teaching provide in this particular moment from the lessons that from these processes that the church has undergone to encourage the leadership of Latinos? What can it bring to the broader political society of the United States?
Well, I think, really, the Catholic social teaching is a treasure, that needs to be, still uncovered and discovered. I think that there is two principles that apply across the board that are very important and are the basis, the pillars. First of all is the common good. Well, first of all is the dignity of the human person. So anything that applies to us as a community, as a society, has to keep in mind that we're created in the image and likeness of God. And therefore, as a person, as a human person, we have a dignity that cannot be taken from us because it's not bestowed on us by any political party, by any government, by any society. It's just we are children of God, and every person has equal dignity. The other important treasure, I think, is the common good, the sense of the common good. Any society that does not look at achieving the good of all, and the betterment of all, is doomed to fail. Because it's just based on selfishness and the good of a few, and that at some point crumbles. And so the idea of the common good is something that has been lost a lot in American politics. And there is partisanship, and there is individual interest. But there is not that idea of how have I think Pope Francis in Fratelli Tutti in chapter 5 asks, every politician should ask themselves, at the end of the day, what have I done for the betterment of my people, of my country, and I think I have doubts that many of our current legislators and the administration go to bed at night and ask themselves that question. But I would think that, there is a lot that the church can help teach, not just the Catholic Church, but Christianity in general, understood as the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Right.
Because if the church is Catholic, is universal, is inviting, is inclusive, and if we are going to exclusivisms and nationalisms that are exclusivist and that only have, the good is only for a certain amount of people and only certain people belong, then that's completely antithetical to the gospel.
Right, right. And in the interest of time, I want to go straight to questions from the audience now. And fortunately, we do have a reception afterwards, so if not everybody gets their question in, we'll be able to continue the conversation. But if you have any questions, we'll go around the room. Here in the front. Yeah. It's coming, sorry.
My name is Micaela. I'm an undergraduate student at Georgetown, and I had a question about, or something that you mentioned that was really interesting, is remembering our history, remembering and reclaiming the story, and the collapsing between culture and politics. And there's a lot of other good stuff, but I guess my question is, who are these vectors that can change this narrative? I think oftentimes, the narrative has been to prove our innocence. We're not like those illegals. We're not those criminals. We are, we are hardworking. We're this and that. And then it has always changed to the point that now we realize it doesn't matter, that the issue of immigration has always been racialized. It was never, and criminality and who we think is criminal has always been a very racial and political thing. So I feel like I wrote my capstone on Latino Christian nationalism, and one of the things that I found is that their reframing of the issue of immigration, or just understanding, is one that it isn't a racialized issue. It's about lawlessness and order and all of these things. So if we're going to move towards a reclaiming of a story, and we have to, one, make accountable who are dominating these narratives. And I think for the Latino Christian nationalists, it's these ecosystems. It's Univision, it's the pastors, evangelical pastors who are, bestowing these neoliberal values, or there's different spaces. How do we get to a place where we can reclaim the story that, it is about the dignity. It's not about us defending our innocence, that we're better than other Latinos, that we're better than these criminals.
Yeah. So how do we retell that story? Maybe Anna, I'll come to you as somebody who deals in human stories.
Well, congratulations on your capstone. That's great. I just watched SNL And I loved that you had Marcelo Hernandez there doing the scene of the immigrant dad who gives advice. What is it called? Immigrant dad giving advice? Immigrant dad talk show. Immigrant dad talk show. And so I'm just thinking about a stage. The amount of space you take on a stage and how much time you take up on that stage is really important. So for me, like, I love seeing that immigrant dad talk show, and they so freely talk about, and Marcelo Hernandez does this in particular, but you see this with a lot of other comedians. So comedy is a strategy, right? So you see this with a lot of other Latinx comedians, and it's basically identifying different strategies for how we raise people. This may seem very not important, but during the 60s, the field of early childhood development made a huge effort to tell Latina moms and Latin American moms how to raise their children. So this included not speaking two languages in the home. Like my mom was told, I was born and raised in the 70s, and during that period, bilingual learning in the home or multilingual learning in the home, the idea was that multilingual children were literally going to be a menace to society. Menace, like criminal. So the direction you took criminality is really important, right? So that literally multilingual children are going to be a menace to society. So what did a lot of moms in particular do? English only, right? This was also a survival, a strategy, like, you know, because they were worried about their children's education. But that's what the field, the specialists were telling them. What else? Take the bottle away at a certain age. So all these things, from the most intimate ways that parents or caretakers care for their children, to their language, to the erasure of language, which is on the spectrum of a form of genocide, right? When you erase people's language and their culture. So for Marcelo Morales or Hernandez to get up there and say, well, this is how we raise our kids. This is what my mom did with me. It's a way of laughing about something and reclaiming also a socioeconomic class, because a lot of the classes that integrated those ways of learning were the upper educated Latino classes, because they wanted to aspire toward, right, that other type of society that they viewed as orderly and controlled in their raising, in their child rearing. So there's, I think that's a really important space that they're establishing of reclaiming how everyday Latino people, I mean, I know that we're vast and diverse, but how we raise our children. That's a really important, intimate space that we don't think of as generally political, but it really is. Cardi B gets on there, and she has this incredible fusion of the Bronx and the DR when she gets on the stage. Not in crossover in any way. So I think that a way is to take up space. When you do a presentation, do it on what you know. I see a lot of the students, I've been teaching college over 20 years. One of the challenges I've had in my classroom is that a lot of the Latina kids who come in, they're not kids, they're adults, who come in, los muchachos y las muchachas que vienen, they're really reticent to talk a lot, and then suddenly you know the kid's an expert on corridos.
Yes.
Because they grew up with their dad and their uncle and their primo and this and that, and they know all the corridos. And this kid never analyzed a poem in class. But guess what? She knows all the corridos, right? But she was afraid to say, hey, this is my toolbox of knowledge. I know all the corridos. Or like my grandfather didn't read music, but he taught me the music of the Caribbean. Through just singing it, and we had to practice and we had to learn this music. So when I was a young music student, I wrote about El Gran Combo. And it never occurred to me in the 90s, do you know, like what it meant to be a music student. No Latinos in my class except for me, no Latino professors writing about El Gran Combo. So writing about it, writing your capstone on I'm saying from the educational and, like performance and art perspective, writing your capstones, bringing it up in class, knowing your history. That's all of those things are really important, so that in every interaction you have a way of responding.
Maybe to close, come back to you, Mike, quickly with that same question. How do we change the narrative? What is?
I believe that you should not try to reclaim a narrative at all. I think you should define the narrative. I think if you spend your life trying to fight against institutions, you'll end up frustrated, angry, and realize that if you told your story, that's how you become the vector. When I was a young student at Georgetown, I saw so many Latino institutions trying to play by the games of a broader society, and I made a decision as somebody probably your age. I was not going to do that. I refused. And I was summarily dismissed and ignored by a lot of people, exception of Mark, who would take my phone calls. But ultimately what's happening now is people are realizing, hey, what this guy's been saying all along has probably been right. And I'm not saying that to say that I was right. I'm saying that's my story. And be your story. Be that vector to what was just shared. When you tell your story, you change the world. Story is everything. I'm working right now on, and again, I'll be really quick because I know time's an issue. Working with Hollywood right now, and there's a huge dearth, if you haven't noticed, of Latino movies. Hollywood is only buying 3 types of Latino movies. Do you know what they are? Narco traffickers, gangbangers, and the undocumented. Okay? That's all they want. So guess what? I could spend my time fighting them, or I could just end up telling the story and finding another way to do it. Because we all know that we're a lot richer than that. Yeah. So do that. Yeah. Be the vector.
That's a wonderful note to end on. Before we close, I want to preview some upcoming gatherings that we have. On February 18th, we'll hold our next Salt and Light gathering on the role of faith and in America's political realignment, lessons from the field, and it'll be here at Georgetown's Capitol campus. On March 9th, we'll have a gathering discussing women's leadership in a synodal church, which will be on the Hilltop campus across town. And then we'll be hosting our next Dahlgren Dialogue, co-sponsored by our colleagues in the Office of Mission and Ministry at Georgetown, on March 18th on faith, democracy, and the common good, lessons from John Courtney Murray for our times. This conversation will feature Vincent Rougeau, who's the president of the College of the Holy Cross, Rob Vischer, who's the president of the University of St. Thomas, Kathleen Caveney from Boston College, and our own Cardinal McElroy, who is the Archbishop here in Washington. There's so much more we could have covered today, and so thankfully we have a reception afterwards where we can continue the conversation. The discussion was recorded, and we'll post it on our website and social media channels for later viewing. And you can also see follow-up resources from this conversation on that webpage as well. Thanks to everyone who helped put this evening together, including the AV and catering teams, Robbie and Isabel from the Capitol Campus Events team, my colleagues Kim Daniels, Kim Mazik, Chris, Anna, Michaela, Blaine, Luke, and Neil, for their support and the efforts that made this evening such a success. Thanks to all of you for joining us, both those of you here at Georgetown and those online. And finally, please join me in thanking Ana Dini Morales, Mark Hugo Lopez, Mike Madrid, and Mar Munoz Visoso.